Hey guys, today I'll show you a sci-fi thriller film named The Peripheral, Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama is set in the future when the Earth is facing a catastrophic disaster and advanced virtuality technology has subtly altered society. In 2032, a brilliant gamer, Flynn, had just settled her blind mother when she hurriedly found her gaming-obsessed brother in the VR. She couldn't help but flare up in anger. They were almost out of money to buy medicine for their ailing mother, and he was still playing games all the time. Her veteran brother, Burton, didn't seem to care, mentioning that he had received a high-difficulty task in the game. If completed, he would receive a substantial commission. This immediately doused Flynn's anger. She took her brother's gaming gear and put it on herself. This wasn't the first time she had helped her brother complete difficult tasks. Although Flynn wasn't particularly interested in games, her talent was surprisingly high. With her fast reflexes and agile thinking, she could always find the key to a breakthrough at crucial moments. This difficult level that had stumped many players only took Flynn about 10 minutes to clear. However, her ambition wasn't there. She'd rather be a waitress in a dessert shop, considering it more reliable than earning money from gaming. That was until one day, a delivery from afar completely changed Flynn's life. It was a newly developed immersive gaming device from a tech company. Because of Burton's outstanding gaming performance, they specifically invited him to beta test their new game, and they would also pay a handsome testing fee. Burton, worried about his gaming skills not being up to par, requested his more talented sister to help him. Flynn was a bit curious, so she tentatively put on the gaming helmet. As the countdown ended, Flynn felt as if she had traveled through time and was instantly in a bustling city. The roar of motorcycles and the passing gusts of wind made it hard for her to believe this was a game world. Suddenly, a female voice prompt sounded in Flynn's mind, directing her to move in a certain direction. Soon, Flynn arrived at the gates of Buckingham Palace. As she walked in with immense curiosity, she encountered two robot butlers who asked her to register and choose a game nickname. Not long after, a game avatar named Mr. Ice was officially created for her. Through the avatar, Flynn was experiencing the thrill of the game and walking slowly. She finally saw a large number of humans in the back garden. The voice in her head told her it was a celebration event hosted by a tech company. She was then issued the first mission in the game, to approach one of the women and try to get her to take her home. Flynn felt a bit weird about this, but for the hefty game reward, she had to follow the prompts and complete the task using Mr. Ice's avatar. After all, the person who understands a woman best is another woman. After just a few sentences of conversation, this woman named Marielle stood up, signaling for Mr. Ice to follow her home for further understanding and possibly the body check. Before long, the two of them were seated in a private car driven by a robotic butler. Soon after, a voice in Flynn's mind issued a new task. She was to use a potion from her pocket to knock out Marielle. This possibly could be a kidnapping mission, but Flynn didn't overthink it. She quickly took out the potion and placed it under Marielle's nose, causing her to pass out. However, the driver of the car noticed the anomaly and immediately took action. This was not an ordinary robot. It could even drive and fight at the same time, and even pulled out a dagger. But Mr. Ice's reaction was not slow. Relying on the robot not daring to let go of the steering wheel, he held the dagger with both hands, then stomped hard on the brake, sending the robot to meet Robot Jesus. Flynn's mission was completed exceptionally well. Then, the voice in her head directed her to keep going until she reached a stone wall. The wall slowly opened like a curtain, revealing a figure inside. It was the owner of the voice that issued tasks to Mr. Ice and also his guide in this game. When they met, the guide named Alita inexplicably stated, although Mr. Ice was a real person, his existence would not exceed 10 years. Flynn found this baffling. She quickly asked what she should do next. However, Alita stated that today's game was over and they would continue tomorrow. Soon after, Flynn woke up from the real world. Her brother asked about her gaming experience. Flynn exclaimed that it was too realistic, just like being on the scene. But as she was about to stand up, she suddenly felt dizzy. Burton guessed that it was probably a side effect of the game, having some impact on her nervous system. Fortunately, Flynn's pain disappeared shortly after. She then went to a local bar, planning to buy some medicine for her sick mother. Some special painkillers could only be bought on the black market, but the drug dealer was not willing to continue the transaction this time. He required Flynn to pay some extra compensation. Just as the transaction was about to fall through, a man who had lost both legs suddenly appeared. He was one of Flynn's few friends, named Connor. He seemed like a hidden master by dropping something right into the faraway trash can. He took a stance as if he was ready to fight the dealer to the end. He managed to intimidate the dealer in an instant. Thanks to him, Flynn successfully obtained the needed medicine. When Flynn returned home and prepared to take some water to her brother, she found him sitting on the floor in pain, the lines on his protruding back faintly glowing. She knew it was the neural control device implanted in her brother. Although it could make the game's reaction speed faster, it could also cause considerable damage to the body. Flynn consciously did not disturb her brother, understanding that he was also working hard for the family. Early the next morning, Flynn couldn't wait to get her gaming gear ready. The gaming experience from the previous day was simply too wonderful. However, this time when she entered the game, Flynn's experience was completely different. Her avatar was fixed on an operating table, with every part of her body down to her fingertips unable to move. Alita announced that an eyeball replacement surgery was about to be performed on Mr. Ice. Flynn found this truly horrifying and wanted to disconnect from the game. However, Alita informed her that players couldn't exit the game on their own. Only the guide Alita could perform this operation. Experiencing her own eyeball being removed was a unique sensation. Flynn felt her whole body breaking out in goosebumps, yet she could not resist in any way. All she could do was watch as the doctor removed her eyeball, then implanted a new pair into the sockets. When Mr. Ice woke up again, thankfully he didn't feel any discomfort. For the sake of the massive reward, he had no choice but to endure. Afterward, Alita issued a new task. It was to use the advanced privileges of the newly implanted eyeball to open several anti-theft doors. The original owner of the new eyeball was the beautiful Marielle, whom Mr. Ice had kidnapped the day before. Her identity must be extraordinary. After Alita led Mr. Ice through door after door, they finally reached a hidden space on the 87th floor underground. Inside hung an inverted metal triangular prism. Alita said this was a great gift for Mr. Ice, then asked him to focus his untransplanted eye on the prism. A thin beam of light burst from inside, as if conveying some important information. Before Mr. Ice could understand what was happening, a tall figure suddenly appeared outside the secret chamber. Alita seemed a bit flustered, stating that the newcomer was here to eliminate them. Mr. Ice, however, wasn't frightened at all. He quickly ran up to engage, but was subdued in just a few moves. Alita was ready with a secret move and was about to charge forward when unexpectedly the adversary pulled out a sonic gun. The burly man tried to force Alita to reveal their companions, but Alita wouldn't give in. Meanwhile, Mr. Ice wasn't sitting idly by. He desperately tried to break free from the electronic handcuffs on his hands, tearing off a layer of flesh in the process. Finally, he managed to free himself. He didn't have time to wonder why his bones were made of metal and was preparing to charge when he was sent flying by a shot. The burly man, looking smug, stated that as long as he got his head, he could find out his real identity. He then pulled the trigger. At the same time, Flynn woke up in the real world. She felt dizzy and couldn't help but run outside to vomit violently. All the while, and in a chicken voice, she screamed she would never play this game again. Flynn spent the entire day lying on her bed, lost in deep thought like a thoughtful pig. She had begun to notice the strange aspects of the game. Even though the gaming experience was incredibly realistic, the storyline was devoid of morals. Particularly, the notion of replacing one's bones with machinery was puzzling. Suddenly, Flynn had a strange feeling that this might not be a game at all, but a real world. Later in the afternoon, she received an odd phone call. The caller claimed that the game she was logged into was far more complex than she imagined, and she was in extreme danger. She needed to log in immediately. Flynn felt a chill and hastily hung up the phone. At the same time, a police officer noticed a suspicious group at a gas station and decided to follow them. Along the way, he was stopped by a bearded man with a gun, telling him to stand in the middle of the road. Next, the officer was sent flying like a duck toy by a massive force coming from an entirely invisible car. They must be the assassins sent out to harm Flynn. Flynn finally finished work for the day, but just as she powered down her computer, the store's equipment turned itself back on. A message appeared on every monitor, stating that a bounty of 90 million had been posted on the dark web, with the aim to eliminate Flynn's entire family. She had to log into the game as soon as possible. In another scene, a cup of coffee is mysteriously floating in the air. The police officer, curious, reaches out to touch it, as if something is holding the coffee up. When he reaches out to the space where the coffee is located, a shell suddenly becomes visible in the air. After feeling around for a bit, he manages to open a door handle. He is shocked to find an invisible car. Not far away in a small grove, a group of well-equipped professional mercenaries are scanning their surroundings. They are the users of the invisible car. They had accepted a high bounty of 90 million on the dark web the day before to hunt down Flynn's family living nearby. Fortunately, Flynn herself received a warning from a mysterious person in in time and relayed the message to her brother, who was dining with his veteran comrades. However, he thought it was the biggest joke in the world. Flynn realized it was hard to explain and went to her mother's room. The group of young men, feeling idle, decided to launch a drone. The footage they received shocked everyone. More than a dozen fully armed men in black were stealthily approaching them. Without a doubt, what Flynn had said was true, but Burton and his group were not at all flustered. They decided to make sure the mercenaries wouldn't return. Everyone extended their arms, and their internal nerve control devices connected instantly. Now they could sense the enemy's position through the drone at any time. One of the computer experts even activated a signal interception system. So while the mercenaries were scouting, Burton and his group remained seated in their original position, but in reality, they were ready and waiting in the dark corners. When the mercenaries entered the ambush circle, everyone opened fire simultaneously. The enemy fell one after another in the sudden attack. Even if some managed to hide under the drone's detection, they had nowhere to hide. Flynn, hiding in her room, discovered that mercenaries had infiltrated during the chaos. She first used a vacuum cleaner to distract them, then seized the opportunity to pull the trigger in her hand. A sudden assault emerged, then vanished without a trace. Burton discovered that 2 enemy machine gunners were missing. He realized that they must have intercepted the drone surveillance. Just then, in the darkness, a barrage of gunfire erupted. Burton and his team were pinned down without the drone's positioning assistance, and both sides quickly fell into a stalemate. Unexpectedly, the sound of a motorcycle roared from the depths of the woods, followed by a burst of machine gun fire. As Burton and his team stood astonished, a man emerged from the darkness. It was Flynn's friend, Connor, who had swooped in and eliminated the remaining 2 machine gunners. Finally, they had completely eliminated the invading enemies. Flynn also realized that the mysterious man who had warned her wasn't joking, so she reconnected her gaming equipment. This time, she entered the game with a new identity because her brother's avatar, Mr. Ice, had already died. Flynn looked at herself in the mirror with astonishment. Although her facial features hadn't changed, her whole persona had clearly been elevated. Just then, a man suddenly appeared. It was the same mysterious man who had previously come to warn Flynn. His name was Wilf, acting as Flynn's guide in the game. Flynn was full of questions, wondering if this was really a game world and why the mercenaries were trying to hunt her down. Wilf advised her to shut up her smelly mouth. He would reveal everything he knew, and then he led her out of the room. But seeing that, Flynn's smelly mouth dropped open in surprise, unable to believe this was London in the year 2100. She hadn't time traveled, but had transmitted her consciousness here through a quantum tunnel. This body was just a high-tech shell. Flynn initially couldn't accept this explanation, thinking it was a lie fabricated by the others. Wilf had no choice but to present evidence from the future. He said that Flynn's mother would die in 4 weeks, clearly printed in the newspapers of that time. Flynn thought it was impossible. Her mother wasn't that sick, but Wilf insisted that Flynn's mother actually had a brain tumor. Then, Wilf dropped a bombshell, saying that future technology had developed a drug to treat brain tumors. He had sent the formula to a pharmacy, paid the necessary fees, and now all Flynn had to do was pick it up and test it. As it concerned her mother's safety, Flynn didn't even have time to ask other questions before logging off. Meanwhile, Burton and his men were still cleaning up the battlefield. Flynn didn't even glance their way before hurrying to the pharmacy mentioned by Wilf. After giving her name, she actually received a box of experimental drugs. However, Flynn didn't dare to let her mother try it immediately. It was only after confronting her mother about the brain tumor that she broke down. It turned out that her mother had been hiding her condition to avoid worrying her children. The doctor had already made it clear that her mother had no more than 2 months left. Flynn had no more reservations. After getting her mother's agreement, she injected the experimental drug into her body. At the same time, she felt a growing curiosity and anticipation for the miraculous future world. Whether the drug worked or not, at least some of the information they revealed was real. So Flynn returned to the future world. This time, she woke up in a gorgeous backyard. Wilf told her that this was the estate of his boss, who was extraordinarily wealthy. Even the pets he kept were animals that had long since become extinct. As for some essential information about Flynn, it was better to let the boss explain it himself. Finally, they got to the point. The boss, Lev, explained the reason they were in such a rush to get Flynn online was because they wanted to know the whereabouts of the game guide Alita, who had mysteriously disappeared a few days ago. Flynn was the last person to have contact with Alita, who held the authority to manage Flynn's future timeline. This was very important to everyone. However, after hearing this, Flynn was even more confused. She didn't understand why they were so interested in her future, but Lev was unwilling to reveal more information. Flynn had no choice but to take what she could get. Since they were all from the future, she asked them to tell her what would happen to her and her family. However, they were equally reluctant to give more information because the future was not set in stone and could be influenced by the present. Giving information about future events could potentially lead to a paradox, and they were unwilling to risk it. Flynn got agitated. She asked when her mother would recover. Unexpectedly, a technician replied that the medication her mother had received only had a 50% success rate. Whether she could recover entirely was left to fate. Flynn was utterly unsettled. She declared that she would not reveal any information about Alita unless her mother was healed. When she returned to the real world, she found a police officer interrogating her brother. Flynn worried that last night's firefight had been discovered. However, it turned out she was overthinking. Just a few hours ago, the police had accidentally discovered 2 invisible cars, a technology unheard of until now. During their search, they found a specialized bullet, indicating the car owners were not ordinary people. For safety reasons, the police came to the nearby Flynn's house for inquiries. Fortunately, her brother Burton had known the officer for many years and successfully got rid of him, not letting him see the spectacular scene of dealing with a body in their backyard. Flynn heaved a sigh of relief and told Burton about her future experiences, guessing that if another assassin were to come, she would be notified in time. But Burton believed they should rely on themselves. He had already communicated with his veteran comrades, and they would stay at the house on guard duty for a while. As for Flynn's warnings from the future, he didn't believe them at all. However, in the next moment, Burton won the lottery. Not due to his luck, but thanks to the news Flynn received from Wilf. The siblings received a large sum of money, and Burton decided to purchase a batch of weapons for better defense. He also started to accept his sister's claims about the future world. Flynn suddenly brought up a person, their friend Connor, hoping Burton would let him join as well. But Burton opposed it because Connor always held a beer can, and involving him in their defense could cause trouble. However, Flynn saw him as a reliable person, and eventually Burton was persuaded. That night, they found a drunken Connor. It turned out they were old comrades, but their relationship had become somewhat strained. Upon learning that Flynn was being targeted by a group of professional mercenaries, Connor was ignited with raging fire. He had had enough of his mundane life and decided to stay at Flynn's house to closely protect her sexy body. At this time, Flynn still harbored doubts about the parallel universe. She searched the internet for names like Wilf, but found no information. Suddenly, there was a noise from the living room. Flynn rushed over and turned on the light, only to find her mother searching for food in the room. They then realized her mother's vision had remarkably recovered. Clearly, her chronic disease was improving. In the future world, after Flynn logged off, her body was temporarily managed by artificial intelligence. In front of her, Wilf and his boss Lev initiated a secret conversation. Initially, the boss wasn't aware of Flynn's existence. However, after Wilf's introduction, he met Alita, who was in charge of controlling Flynn's future timeline, and consequently developed a keen interest in Flynn. Presumably, there were some immense secrets hidden within her that even the big shots coveted. Wilf wanted to know what they were, but the boss was persistently secretive. Because of a virtual game, Flynn and her family were drawn into a massive conspiracy. For safety, Burton gathered his retired comrades to strengthen their home's defenses. Flynn was the primary person to be protected, with drones tracking and detecting her all the time. He also bought a 3D printing shop to fabricate various advanced weapons. Flynn was always cautious and thought Burton was too showy, especially when she saw the new car parked in front of the store. She didn't know how to explain where the money came from. The siblings discussed in the car, feeling that their recent experiences in the future world were too bizarre. Burton felt the need to keep it confidential, but Flynn revealed that she had already told everything to her best friend Billy. Burton was instantly furious. After all, Billy's husband's uncle, Corbel, was the most powerful drug lord in the area. In the middle of their conversation, Burton's phone received a notification for Flynn to log on. The scene shifts to London in the year 2100. Wealthy businessman Lev opens a box, surprisingly revealing Flynn's avatar, which is usually stored there. The guide Wilf finds this a bit inappropriate, but Lev thinks that objects should be kept in wooden boxes. Just then, Flynn logs on, replacing the artificial intelligence. She glances at the box behind her, and Lev, embarrassed, quickly changes the subject. By now, Flynn's mother's illness has been cured, so it's time for Flynn to fulfill her promise. She recounts in detail her infiltration into the underground building with Alita. Flynn remembers that Alita should have escaped. The technician immediately provides information. They infiltrated a research institute, specifically the highly classified Time Research Department. As for what the two were trying to obtain, Lev clearly knows but refuses to disclose anything. Sensing the tension, the technician changes the subject, saying they've detected a notorious drug lord named Corbell frequently accessing Flynn's data. Apparently, he intends to harm her. Upon hearing this, Flynn is greatly shocked. Corbell is a notorious figure in the town. More than 10 years ago, he was just an unknown car repair shop owner. Once, under the guise of offering free car modifications, he suffocated an entire gang inside a car. As the group struggled for help painfully inside the vehicle, Corbell and his nephew were outside, chatting and laughing his beards off. He even ended up nailing them to crosses by the roadside. Over the years, Corbell has become a famous drug lord locally through his ruthlessness. Presumably, someone has paid him to target Flynn's family. Upon learning this news, Flynn asked the technician to log her off so she could find her brother Burton. Burton reassures Flynn that he will handle the cold-blooded Corbell. That afternoon, Burton confronts the infamous man without fear. He proposes a deal. He will provide Corbell with $200,000 weekly to ensure his and his family's safety. If Corbell refuses and insists on harming them, Burton warns he'll show him why roses are red. With a flick of his finger, Burton shatters a water cup on the table, demonstrating the true strength of a veteran. It turns out that all veterans have a neural control device implanted in their bodies, enabling them to establish real-time communication networks and enhancing their strength and speed. Now, Burton has gathered all the veterans in the town, forming a perfectly coordinated killing machine. Even the notorious Corbell has to weigh his options and ultimately gives up the bounty, siding with Burton. As a result, Corbell gets a taste of the benefits, receiving the $200,000 protection fee that night. However, as the largest drug lord locally, he is unwilling to cooperate obediently. He hands a stack of banknotes to his nephew, insisting he find out why Burton has suddenly become so wealthy. After all, just a week ago, Burton was so poor he had to scramble to raise money for their mother's medical treatment. The nephew is the perfect candidate for the investigation because his wife Billy is one of Flynn's few close friends. Wilf in the future world was actively searching for the missing Alita. Before long, he arrived at his foster mother's home. As children, Wilf and Alita, both orphans, were adopted by a wealthy businessman. However, as they grew up, they went their separate ways. Wilf rarely visited his foster mother's home, and as a result, she harbored resentment towards him, always harboring a frown. Wilf glanced at the robot maid, who bore a striking resemblance to Alita, before stating his purpose. He wanted to know Alita's whereabouts. His foster mother glared at him, but ultimately revealed a key piece of information. Alita once mentioned her residence was where the snow last fell in London, but Wilf didn't understand the meaning behind it. He had to wait for Flynn to log on, hoping she could use her memories from that night to trace Alita's whereabouts. Their car soon arrived at a three-way intersection. Flynn remembered passing through here when she first met Alita, but couldn't recall the exact route. They decided to get out of the car and split up to search for clues. Before separating, Wilf taught Flynn how to use sensory sharing. It's surprising how advanced the future world was. By simply rubbing her fingers, Flynn could share her senses with others, even detect their moods. Wilf thought of Flynn as a pure and joyful girl. Subsequently, they went their separate ways. Before long, Flynn, walking alone on the street, was targeted by a police robot. Wilf noticed and warned Flynn not to say anything out of turn. He then hurriedly approached. In this future world, not just anyone could connect to it. Legal permission was required. Flynn, who had arrived here via a gaming device, was clearly an illegal user. The robot police detected an anomaly just by observing her movements. Luckily, Wilf kept his cool. While asking the technician to modify the database, he explained to the police that his girlfriend was unsatisfied with her avatar, so she had rented a temporary one. To make his story more convincing, he even kissed Flynn, but without using his tongue. With this maneuver, they managed to bluff their way out of the situation. The technician immediately executed the log-off operation. However, Flynn took a while to calm down. She never imagined that the touch in the future world would feel so real, even evoking emotions. When she logged in again, she found a distressed Wilf, because the search for Alita was still fruitless. But when she heard the hint about the last time the snow fell in London, she had a bold idea. Snow wasn't referring to the weather. It referred to a person named Snow. Wilf immediately caught on. Alita admired a historical figure named John Snow, who died at 18 Sackville Street in London. That could very likely be Alita's residence. With a breakthrough seemingly imminent, their true adversary finally surfaced. It's a bald woman named Charisse, who's in charge of the research institute. Ever since learning that Alita had stolen an important item from the company, she initiated a citywide manhunt. This was the real reason Alita went into hiding, and unfortunately, Flynn got dragged into the mess. Charisse was set on silencing Flynn permanently. The The professional mercenaries and the mob lord Corbel were all under her command. Despite Flynn still being alive and Alita's whereabouts unknown, Charisse was dissatisfied with her security chief, threatening him to jump off the building if there were no progress. The security chief quickly found an important clue, an employee of the time management department who was Alita's college roommate. Charisse confronted this employee and finally coerced her into revealing that she was the one who leaked the department's confidential information to Alita. She also discovered Alita's secret residence. Charisse then forced the employee to ingest a drug that made her exude pheromones, attracting countless bees to bid her tragic fate. On the other side, Wilf and Flynn arrived at the address hinted at earlier. Flynn recognized it as the place where she first met Alita. They ventured into an old loft down an alleyway. This must be Alita's residence. But the sight inside took Flynn by surprise. The antique clock in the center of the living room was identical to the one in her own home. Even her house's model was on the table, with Burton and a few comrades prominently displayed. Flynn couldn't understand why Alita was so interested in her. Although Alita wasn't in the room, Wilf found her implant chip, which could retrieve information about Alita's activities. Just as they were preparing to leave, the security chief arrived with robot assassins. Flynn once again experienced the power of the sonic gun, nearly causing her to collapse even in the real world. Fortunately, Wilf wasn't an easy target and managed to counterattack the robots. Flynn seized the opportunity to take the sonic gun, finally avenging herself. Then, she angrily questioned the chief about why he wanted to kill her. Just as he mentioned that Flynn had taken something, the fallen robot suddenly stood up and killed the security chief with one stroke. It turned out that Charisse was controlling it remotely, intending to kill witnesses. Flynn, in a fit of rage, didn't hesitate to pull the trigger on the robot. The scene shifts to 2075's London, where the entire city was filled with dense fog. Ruined buildings could be seen everywhere, reminiscent of an apocalyptic world. A group of children gathered in a bus after collecting supplies. Young Wilf was punished for having the least loot and was not allowed to eat lunch. Alita, who was beside him, comforted him and offered to share her food. Just then, the children saw people outside distributing free food. Everyone thought it was a trap, but Wilf decided to take a look regardless. As he approached, he tentatively threw a stone over. The scene of food distribution disappeared instantly. It was indeed a trap. As a result, Wilf and Alita were both captured by a mysterious organization. Their childhood memories ended there. Now, Wilf handed Alita's implant chip to his boss, hoping to decode it quickly and find Alita's whereabouts. However, Lev looked worried. Without the immunity boost from the implant chip, Alita might not survive much longer. Moreover, Wilf had a direct encounter with the Research Institute's people in Alita's home. It was highly likely that his identity had been exposed. And that wasn't even the worst part. Flynn was severely injured during the last fight, with her real-life body also taking a hit. In particular, her right hand would often convulse uncontrollably. This was a side effect from her first time entering the future world, forcibly breaking free from the handcuffs. Burton urged his sister to rest for a while and to refrain from entering the future world again. But stubborn Flynn disagreed. Everyone was now caught up in a conflict they didn't understand, and escaping wasn't as simple as wanting to. In the midst of their argument, Flynn suddenly collapsed. She began to convulse violently. Thankfully, she returned to normal after about 10 minutes. However, Burton still insisted on going to the hospital, fearing it was a side effect from the time travel device. The examination results came out quickly. The symptoms Flynn exhibited were a type of epilepsy, but her EEG looked perfectly healthy. Burton remained worried, revealing to the doctor that his sister had been playing an immersive game recently. After hearing this, the doctor nodded and advised Flynn to stop playing the game. This time, Flynn was much more receptive. She didn't bring up the future world again, but started watching old family videos on her own. Burton expressed relief and sincere apologies. He shouldn't have let Flynn get involved with that game. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been harmed. But Flynn didn't regret it at all. At least their mother had regained her health because of it, and she had experienced a wonderful world from the future. Burton, who had never entered the future world, was scratching his head after hearing Flynn's description. He was curious to see this mysterious world, hoping to uncover the truth behind the events. But his comrades strongly opposed this. If he ended up injured like Flynn, how would they resist the next wave of attacks? The disabled strongman Connor had a bright idea. He could use a healthy avatar in the future world, making him the most suitable candidate. The scene switched to future world London. The head of the Research Institute, Charisse, had recreated the body of the security chief. In the previous conflict, the chief had unfortunately died, but his consciousness was intact. After being implanted into a new body, he quickly identified Wilf's identity. He was Alita's brother and also Lev's right-hand man. With just a turnaround, Cherise arrived at the mansion of Lev, the theft gang leader. She pointed out that Lev had hired Alita to steal the Institute's secret technology, but Lev wasn't a pushover either, challenging her that if they had lost something, they should report it to the police. Clearly, the Institute's secret technology wasn't something that should be made public. Cherise didn't dwell on the matter, but started talking about the big picture. The current society was founded by 3 powers. Among them, the London Police Department was responsible for maintaining order and ensuring peace. The Research Institute provided advanced technology. The two supported each other. Only the theft gang led by Lev existed in a gray area. He had established a new order in chaos and, while indispensable, should not reach into the technological domain of the Institute. Otherwise, societal order would collapse and bury everyone. Lev naturally wouldn't be easily persuaded. He stated that the biggest advantage of criminal gangs was unity, and they weren't afraid of any challenges or threats. Cherise chuckled. They had once easily ruined a businessman by adjusting the assembly workers' program. If the two sides really started a conflict, the Institute still had many powerful secret weapons stored. Her threatening words plunged Lev into deep thought. Cherise hadn't been gone long when Flynn's avatar in the room made a move. This time it was Connor who had logged in. Feeling the freely moving legs and arms, Connor felt as though he had been reborn. After casually smashing a window, Flynn's avatar took a step into the yard, preparing to go out and explore. The technician quickly noticed Flynn's unusual behavior and forced her to log out through his device. Burton and his group realized that they had to get rid of the forced logouts first before further exploration. In the room, Flynn, who had been watching family videos, was visited by Wilf. He had used the advanced technology stolen by Alita to communicate with Flynn in the real world from the future world. Wilf had come to apologize. He hadn't known that the wearable device would cause such severe harm to Flynn. After several days of reflection, Flynn felt like she was just a tool being manipulated. Lev had only seen her as a pawn to achieve his interests. Flynn had looked up information and found that in her world, there was also a businessman named Lev, who was murdered along with his family. This information startled Wilf, who obviously didn't know much about his boss, Lev. He confronted Lev immediately. This time, Lev revealed that he hired Alita to steal the Institute's technology because controlling the time stake could yield enormous business profits. For example, the birth of a new drug requires extensive testing and high costs. With time technology, this step can be bypassed. He then openly admitted that he had hired people to kill the Lev family in Flynn's world because he did not allow another version of himself with different ideas to exist in another world. Wilf felt a chill as he watched his boss's nonchalant expression. Meanwhile, Flynn in the real world was also in a state of anxiety, especially remembering the family models she had seen at Alita's house. She kept wondering what those people were planning and why they involved her and her family. Burton suggested they just treat the future world as a game. If they could clear the game, they would win. This was Flynn's area of expertise. The key to clearing the game was to understand the rules and take the initiative. Burton added that the more teammates in the game, the better. Flynn decided to log in to help Burton create a few avatars so they could participate together. When she returned to the future world again, she found her avatar playing ball with a few children. Flynn felt like she was merely a toy, but the technician didn't seem to mind. Flynn sighed and asked the technician to prepare a few avatars for her. Then she prepared to leave the mansion and explore the outside world. The technician quickly asked his assistant to cut off Flynn's line, but this time it didn't work. It turned out that in the real world, Burton had arranged for 2 computer experts to hack into Flynn's connection and block her logout operation. Now the technician was panicked and asked Flynn what she was intending to do. Flynn was frank. She didn't want to see things arranged in advance anymore. Instead, she wanted to explore the truth of this world. For example, why did Alita say she could only live for 10 years? Why did the population on Earth suddenly halve? The technician had no other options and eventually compromised. He took Flynn to a desolate grassland, saying this place was like a museum, recording every major event that had ever happened on Earth. As the codes were inputted, Flynn saw the first tipping point of Earth's decline. In 2039, which was 7 years after Flynn's current timeline, a global-scale blackout caused by a hacker attack lasted for several months. The Earth's population began to decline rapidly. Following this was a virus rampage. The virus, known as the blood plague, directly affected human organs and had a high mortality rate. Then came environmental disasters such as drought, antibiotic resistance, and a massive reduction in agriculture. Within the following 40 years, at least 7 billion people died. This was not the end. Some countries suffered terrorist attacks, and they detonated nuclear missile wells. Flynn was shocked to see this. The first place to explode was her city. The cruel truth left Flynn unable to calm down for a long time. However, from some details, it can be seen that the future world is still filled with viruses or nuclear pollution. Only with the air purification equipment from the Research Institute and the immunity brought by the implanted chip can humans survive safely. As shown earlier in the 2075 timeline, Wilf in his childhood lived in a post-nuclear explosion environment. The Research Institute or the theft gang depended on plundering the population to thrive and eventually established future London, a suitable environment for human habitation in the apocalypse. The Research Institute is indeed the beneficiary. Alita was initially hired by Lev from the theft gang, but she later realized his true color. That's why she disappeared, making both sides unable to find her. The scene then shifts to a man receiving a mysterious package containing a crafted bracelet. Clasping it in his curious hand, he was taken aback and found his cabinet full of shattered porcelain. As he gaped in surprise, his phone began to ring. It was the security chief from the Research Institute. The security chief knew well that this man, named Bob, was a renowned local professional hitman. Now he was offering Bob a handsome reward of $10 million to take out Flynn, gifting him a sonic gun as his weapon. Bob wanted to refuse, but the security chief threatened him by revealing his daughter's residential address. Weighing the pros and cons, this notorious hitman accepted the task. But instead of seeking out Flynn immediately, Bob visited his former partner. He was sure his partner was the one who had divulged his daughter's location. His partner did not deny this, explaining that the client had contacted him long ago, but he was too old to take on the task. So he recommended Bob instead and tactfully hinted at the importance of his daughter. After listening, Bob's face fell. He pulled out his handgun and, in a fluid series of actions, shot his old partner and his 3 sons dead on the spot. Afterwards, Bob got back into his car, obtained Flynn's whereabouts from his employer, and learned that Flynn was due for a hospital visit the next morning. Suddenly, a gunshot sounded from outside the car. It seemed there had been a survivor. Bob pulled out his sonic gun and knocked the person flat. Seeing the assailant was not dead, he mercifully warned that he'd run him over in 1 minute if he didn't leave. But the man was unable to even crawl away due to broken limbs and could only watch helplessly as Bob drove towards him. In a blink of an eye, it was the next day. Flynn, undergoing a checkup at the hospital, was unaware that she was being targeted. After her puncture test, the doctor informed her that her occipital lobe, responsible for processing visual information, was damaged. Burton was worried. It seemed to be a side effect of wearing the VR device. Meanwhile, hitman Bob had stopped on a bridge, a route Flynn was bound to take on her way home. However, before Flynn showed up, he was approached by Flynn's close friend Billy. Billy thought Bob's car had broken down and asked if he needed help. Slightly annoyed, Bob lied that a tow truck was already on its way. Billy believed him and was about to leave, but quickly reversed back, feeling guilty about leaving an old man alone. Bob was about to refuse when he saw Flynn and her brother's car approaching. Now he pulled out his sonic gun. Fortunately, Flynn was familiar with it and managed to dodge the first attack. Burton slammed on the accelerator, intending to flee for his shitty life, but unexpectedly crashed into the guardrail. Flynn's car door was jammed, causing immense panic. Burton had no choice but to exit the car and fire bullets in succession. However, the hitman, clad in a bulletproof vest, remained unscathed. Flynn had to manually control the car, but she was still targeted by the hitman. At the crucial moment, Billy pulled out a shotgun. Seeing the adversary still unyielding, Billy fired another shot, finally subduing the hitman. Not much later, Officer Tommy arrived at the scene. Since this was a public place, Burton, fearing the situation would escalate, decided to call the police. Tommy had been friends with Burton and Flynn since childhood. After days of meticulous observation, he suspected the siblings were hiding something from him. Although Flynn had a soft spot for him and had also guessed that the hitman was hired by the Future World Institute, she still kept her lips sealed, revealing no information. On the way back, Flynn expressed her concern. The secrets about the future world couldn't be hidden for much longer. Moreover, they had received no warning from Wilf about this attack. Burton was reassured by Billy to let go of his worries. After all, Flynn had already confided everything to him. Upon arriving home, Burton was surprised Flynn was so careless, sharing secrets with Billy. Flynn had her reasons, though. Billy was her best friend in this world. As they were talking, they realized their mother was in the backyard. It seemed as though she had discovered the buried corpse of the mercenary. The siblings had no choice but to reveal the secrets of the future world to their mother. Now, there was another person in the know. It wouldn't be long before the secret of the future world would become public knowledge. Their mother understood the situation after hearing the full story. She believed that taking the initiative was the right approach. Upon hearing this, Flynn stood up, as if she had made a determination in her heart. Before long, Flynn found herself in the future world. She found Wilf through her avatar and told him about the attack she had suffered, questioning why he hadn't warned her in advance as he had promised. To her surprise, Wilf had no knowledge of the hitman's attack, let alone warning her beforehand. This realization left a chill in Flynn's heart. Clearly, their technological strength was no match for the Institute. However, Flynn, who had previously shared sensory experiences with Wilf, couldn't help feeling a fondness for him. She expressed her trust in him and asked him to take her somewhere. Soon, they arrived near the Institute's building. It turned out Flynn's plan was to directly confront the Institute's head, Cherise, as an effective countermeasure to the assassination attempts. Wilf tried to dissuade her one last time, stressing the severe repercussions of such an action unless she was clear about why she was doing it and felt justified. Back in the real world, Officer Tommy was driving the hitman to the police station. Bob, however, maintained a smug smile, exuding an unwarranted confidence that made Tommy furrow his brow. Eventually, Bob spoke up, urging Tommy to let him go or he'd invite big trouble, as his people don't leave loose ends. Suddenly, a great force hit them, flipping the police car over. It was the work of an invisible car. Not long after, an injured Tommy saw a shadowy figure approach and drag Bob away from the back seat. By the time he managed to crawl out of the car, he heard the roar of a car engine fading in the distance. Clearly, these people were lawless to the extreme. Meanwhile, Flynn in the future world, perhaps sensing this, didn't heed Wilf's advice to swallow her pride. Instead, she marched straight into the lobby of the Institute. Cherise confidently walked over to Flynn to flex her bald head. The two women met for the first time, neither showing any awkwardness. Flynn pleaded with her to stop hunting her and her family, but Cherise stated it was impossible since Flynn had stolen some important data. Flynn, looking innocent, denied taking anything. Cherise sneered, saying that if Flynn continued to deny it, she would face death. Flustered, Flynn decided that if there was no room for negotiation, they had to confront each other. Even though Cherise was just an avatar, if she were to die, her real body would still feel the pain. But Cherise reached out to strangle Flynn. Flynn retaliated, managing to knock her to the ground after several turns. She warned her that next time, it would be her real body. The scene shifts to a flashback on Alita. Just 1 month before her disappearance, she suddenly reached out to a dorm mate from school who had considerable authority in the Institute's management during their time there. The next day, the two of them arrived at the core of the time management department. With her friend's introduction, Alita finally understood that the green crystal in front of her was actually a massive storage device containing all the data from the Institute. Among it all, the most exciting thing was a secret project to save the world. They used time stakes in the past world under the guise of a technology company to implant neural control devices in military personnel. Initially, these devices could only enhance the combat capabilities of soldiers, but it made people become irritable and emotionless. However, after careful modifications, the experimental subjects began to show compassion. Her friend had a smug expression on her face, suggesting that if this technology was extended to all of humanity, there would be no more riots. But Alita felt uneasy about this. After all, they were all real people. Soon after, the two left the secret lab and ran into staff member Marielle on the way. Presumably, it was from this moment that Alita began to think about stealing the Institute's secrets to prevent the neural control plan. But Marielle, who happened to be passing by, became her kidnapped target, as shown at the beginning of the drama, and contributed her eye to Alita's incursion into the lab. From the experimental video at the time, it can be seen that Burton and his comrades were the first experimental subjects of the neural control device. During a test, Connor had both legs and one arm blown off. Perhaps because they were the first generation, these veterans did not seem to show much compassion, but this should be a hidden danger. This also explains to some extent why models of Burton and his comrades were found in Alita's home. The scene shifts back to Flynn killing Cherise's avatar. Wilf was panicked and took her away from the scene, warning her to be careful of retaliation. But Flynn didn't seem to care. She felt the people on the street were indifferent, with little interaction between them. Wilf did not explain, but showed Flynn a controlling gesture instead. When she mimicked the action, the people on the street instantly disappeared. It turned out that this was a virtual technology developed by the Institute, just to add a bit of liveliness. Not only that, the grand and magnificent city was also optimized by virtual technology. In fact, they hadn't had time to repair the dilapidated buildings yet. Flynn couldn't help but marvel at the power of the Institute's technology. She then remembered that Charisse had accused her of stealing the Institute's data, but she didn't even know where the data was. Perhaps only by finding Alita could the puzzle be solved. Wilf took out a chip found in Alita's home, which had the manufacturer's mark on it. Perhaps they could start their investigation from there. Without a moment's delay, the two arrived at the location of this underground manufacturer. The place was indeed very hidden. On the surface, it was just an ordinary pork shop, but in actuality, it was a production workshop for making chips for transformed avatars. Flynn pretended to be a customer, easily probing their secrets. Seeing that they were ready to get forceful once their cover was blown, she transformed into her super killer guise. Flynn single-handedly fought two lunatics and subdued them. After some intense questioning, Flynn and Wilf finally obtained important information from them. It turned out that Alita had previously commissioned them to create the avatar, Mr. Ice, thereby enabling it to have the functionality of an implanted eyeball. After hearing this, Wilf was shocked. He did not expect Alita to belong to the Neoprims, because only they still insisted on performing surgeries with scalpels. Afterwards, while Wilf was helping Flynn wipe off her blood, he began to explain that the so-called Neoprims is an organization aiming to overthrow the world order of the future. As for specific information, he didn't know much. Flynn listened with a skeptical frown, feeling that he was hiding something. Flynn had previously commissioned him to create two avatars for her brother and Connor. This was now in full swing. The technology from the future was so exaggerated that by simply tapping a few times on a sphere, the corresponding human tissues would automatically generate in the nutrient solution. It took just half a day for two avatars, indistinguishable from real humans, to be created. The technician was a bit worried. He said that he had detected Flynn's doctor had once searched for information about occipital lobe local infections. He speculated that the reason why Flynn's occipital lobe was infected might be that something was hidden inside it. At this moment, there was a knock on the door. Upon opening it, it turned out to be a senior inspector from the London Police Department who had come for a visit. Lev became nervous upon hearing this news. He instructed Wilf to answer the inspector's questions truthfully and not to lie. Clearly, this inspector was not someone to be trifled with. The scene shifts back to the timeline of 2032. Ever since the hitman Bob, who had ill intentions towards Flynn, was rescued, Officer Tommy has been filled with resentment. After bandaging his wounds, he began to investigate the matter. Unexpectedly, the sheriff advised Tommy to take paid leave and recover from his injuries, reminding him not to push too hard. Tommy chewed on his words, not fully understanding the meaning behind them. Accidentally, he noticed the sheriff's shoes, and his face turned grim. The shadowy figure who had taken Bob away was wearing the exact same shoes. Tommy didn't dare confront the sheriff directly. Instead, he took his advice and obediently went to the hospital for treatment. He never expected the sheriff to be involved as well. As a mere officer, he felt helpless to interfere in this matter. Even his doctor girlfriend advised Tommy to protect himself wisely. However, Tommy was determined and declared he would not run away. He sought out Burton once again and informed him about the sheriff's involvement in the hitman's escape. Everyone knew that the sheriff has a close relationship with the drug lord Corbell. Tommy couldn't help but wonder what forces the Burton family had offended. Burton, however, had been prepared. The enemy he had to face was much more powerful than he had imagined. He advised Tommy not to meddle in the affair, warning that next time it wouldn't just be a simple injury. The scene shifts to the hitman now sitting in the house of Corbell. However, he had a collar around his neck, suggesting his situation wasn't good. Bob tried to attack, but suddenly his body began to convulse. It turns out the collar around his neck could be controlled to deliver a high-voltage shock. This made Bob much more obedient. It turned out that when Corbell learned that Bob was also hired to harm Flynn, he requested the sheriff to hand him over. He wanted to get the identity of the mastermind behind Bob, as well as future-related information from him, intending to gain a huge benefit. However, Bob proved to be a tough nut to crack. Throughout, he didn't reveal a word. Corbell's patience finally ran out. He went to the sheriff to search the database for information about Bob and left his wife to continue working on Bob. But they underestimated Bob's ability. He was a ruthless killer. Pretending to admire a fish tank, he quietly approached and suddenly smashed it with a pre-hidden ashtray. Although Corbell's wife managed to knock him down with an electric shock, the fish tank shattered. Bob took the opportunity to grab her ankle. In her panic, she chose to electrocute him, resulting in both of them being stunned by the shock. The scene switches to future London in 2099. Lev, the boss of a theft gang, is currently being interrogated by an inspector from the police department. When the technician poured him a coffee, his hand couldn't help but tremble. In this future world, due to the presence of implanted chips, anyone's actions are hard to escape from the surveillance of the prosecutor's office. This technician must have done a lot of bad things in the past, but the senior inspector doesn't intend to pursue them. Even the incident where Wilf murdered the security chief of the research institute was clear to her. But in the eyes of the senior inspector, this was a trivial matter. Obviously, she wanted to catch big fish and dig out more inside stories. Especially when the police department noticed the presence of 3 AI-controlled people here, they believed that the theft gang led by Lev and the research institute were planning a big game. As one of the 3 powers of the future world, the police department naturally wanted to get involved. The inspector then ordered Lev to bring out the 3 AI-controlled people and their controllers. It turned out that this was her real purpose for this trip. Lev seemed to be very wary of this inspector. Even if her attitude was arrogant and her demands were unreasonable, he still nodded his head in agreement. Meanwhile, in the real world, Burton and his team received an online notification. For Connor, it was the first time he was using his own control device. After some adjustments by the computer genius, it was finally ready. Connor took a deep breath, his eyes full of excitement. This was something he had always aspired to do. Years ago, Connor had fallen into a trap while on a military mission trying to rescue an injured military dog. His limbs were blown off on the spot. Although he survived, the lingering fear tortured him daily, and his personal life became a mess. The inconvenience of various operations made him feel like he was better off dead. When he learned from Flynn that he could have complete limbs in the future world, he even planned to stay in the future world for the rest of his life and maintain his body in the real world with nutrient fluid. Now, his wish was finally fulfilled. However, as soon as they logged in, the 3 were stunned. They did not expect to be greeted by the inspector from the future world. The inspector's face softened slightly upon their arrival, indicating that she had no intentions of raising a dispute. With Lev's consent, she brought the trio to the police department's training field. Here, they could avoid the surveillance and interference from the institute, and most importantly, train. The inspector casually raised her right arm, and the ruins in the distance began to stir. As steel and concrete extended, an 8-story training building rose from the ground. Flynn's team was shocked, but the inspector seemed unfazed. She said that Burton and Connor, being first-timers in the future world, needed professional training to adapt to their new avatars. She instructed her deputy to take them into the training field, leaving only Flynn by her side, indicating she had a private matter to discuss. Under the guidance of the deputy, Burton and Connor entered the training field. She told them the building had 8 floors, and they needed to eliminate enemies on each level before reaching the rooftop to complete the test. As soon as the deputy announced the start, the lights in the building suddenly went out. Shadows on the ground merged to form several combat robots. Burton and Connor, however, remained calm and quickly took them out. The deputy mentioned that the first floor had 6 robots, and each subsequent floor would add 6 more. Connor curiously removed a mask from one of them, revealing it to be a genuine robot. He exchanged a look with Burton, clearly confident about the upcoming challenges. Meanwhile, outside the training building, Flynn was in shock. The inspector had informed her that according to the data tracked by the police department, in their timeline, Connor was not disabled, and Flynn's brother Burton had died in combat before he retired from the military. This indicated that the Research Institute had opened a time stake many years ago. This meant that the real world where Flynn stayed was in fact a new timeline created by the Institute's forced intervention. The neural control devices used by Burton and his comrades were not applied until a decade later in the original world. Moreover, the end of the world seemed to be accelerating in Flynn's new timeline. As for why the Institute did this, the inspector didn't know either. Hence, she wanted to work with Flynn to uncover the truth. Flynn thought of a question and asked the inspector if it was possible to permanently sever her connection with the future world. The inspector just smiled and didn't answer. Instead, she waved her hand and forcibly logged Flynn out. At this point, Connor and Burton had reached the 5th floor of the training field. The 2 men worked together with an unstoppable synergy, clearly a remnant of their military experience. The neural control device also played a significant role. Before long, they successfully reached the rooftop of the training building. Both Connor and Burton were still in a state of excitement, but the deputy informed them that the training mode wasn't over yet. Out of the three of them, only one could remain standing. The duo exchanged a glance and promptly decided to take out the deputy first. Unexpectedly, the deputy had formidable fighting skills. In no time, she broke the avatar Burton's neck and then pushed Connor off the roof. However, Connor logged out with a smile as he hadn't experienced such a hearty battle in a long time. Flynn received a text message saying that one of Burton's comrades had taken their mother to the hospital and asked them to rush over. What the siblings didn't know was that this was a trap set for them. While Burton and the others were still in the future world, Flynn's mother's old illness suddenly relapsed and her vision became blurry again. She summoned a guard soldier and asked him to take her to the hospital as soon as possible. Bob, the hitman who had just escaped from Corbell's house, was struggling to find a chance to take out the Burton siblings, so he followed Flynn's mother to the hospital. He pulled out a dagger and without hesitation cut a slit in his arm, then disguised himself as an injured person and entered the hospital. The guard escorting Flynn's mother let down his guard, planning to help, but Bob showed his true colors, pulling out his dagger and stabbing wildly. The guard was caught off guard and overwhelmed by Bob and strangled to death. The doctor in the ward heard the fight outside the door. She immediately called her police boyfriend, Tommy, but he didn't answer. She had no choice but to open the door and check on the situation, falling right into the hitman's trap. Flynn's mother and she became hostages. Bob asked them to sit still and then took out the dead guard's phone. After unlocking it, he started sending messages. Upon receiving the message, the Burton siblings rushed to the hospital. Flynn sensed something was off from the tone of the message. Burton asked his comrade to use the neural control device to contact the person who sent the message. But to their surprise, the comrade couldn't detect any vital signs from the sender and told Burton that it must be a trap set by the hitman. Subsequently, they set an ambush near the hospital, ready to stage a desperate counterattack. They strategized on how to use future technology to rescue the hostages. First, they used infrared sensors to survey the situation inside the building. They detected 3 heat sources, likely 2 hostages and 1 hitman. Next, they used the neural control device to connect with their deceased comrade, causing his body to twitch. Bob thought his opponent was still alive and hastily got up to finish him off. This gave the sniper outside a chance to identify the hitman. A shot was fired instantly, causing Bob to fall to the ground. The mother trapped in the hospital was rescued. Burton, still furious, fired several more shots, ensuring the professional hitman was thoroughly dead as a piece of soap. However, the impact this incident had was far from over. Officer Tommy didn't heed the warnings from the sheriff and privately investigated the truth behind the hitman's escape. He first asked the data clerk in the station to understand the latest development in the case. Surprisingly, he was told that the case had been put on hold, as the only evidence on the scene was a damaged police car. Tommy found this incredulous, as he distinctly remembered an invisible car being involved, which was a big deal for the police. Undeterred, Tommy went alone to the police station's evidence room. After breaking the door open, he found the crashed car. Upon a detailed search, he discovered the sonic gun used by the hitman Bob. Curious, Tommy pulled the trigger, only for all the car windows to shatter in the next moment. He was shocked, and suddenly, his phone rang. It was the sheriff, asking him to come over to Corbell's house without giving any explanation. Unable to defy his superior's summons, Tommy arrived at the drug lord's house as soon as possible. Seeing bloody footprints in the living room, he was on high alert. After a thorough search, he found Corbell's wife lying in a pool of blood in the living room. This was clearly the handiwork of the hitman Bob, who killed her while making his escape. Later, Tommy saw the sheriff conspiring with Corbell in the backyard. Perhaps the death of his wife had enraged Corbell, and the sheriff, being in cahoots with him, no longer hid the truth. He ordered Tommy to arrest the Flynn siblings and bring them to the police station, blaming them for bringing the hitman who killed Corbell's wife. Having been a policeman for many years, Tommy wouldn't believe such a flimsy excuse. He exposed the alliance between the sheriff and Corbell. The sheriff claimed he had been elected as sheriff for 4 consecutive terms, and no one would believe Tommy's words. He then promised a promotion and pay raise if Tommy continued to work for him. Tommy's beliefs were shattered. His pride from years of service vanished. As he got back to his car and saw the sonic gun, he made up his mind. He returned once again to the drug lord's house and began to speak, suggesting that there may be another version of the story. The hitman not only killed Corbell's wife, but also the sheriff who had rushed to the scene. He then fired several shots, sending the wicked sheriff to meet his maker. Corbell, who had witnessed everything, naturally couldn't be spared. Tommy picked up the sonic gun and pulled the trigger without mercy. Meanwhile, the inspector in the future world was currently analyzing the battle data of Burton and his group. She found that they had perfectly integrated the neural control device without any side effects. She guessed that this was the latest experimental result of the research institute. Coincidentally, the head of the institute, Cherise, came knocking. She apparently knew about Flynn's visit, but the inspector asked her assistant to log out and delete the information they had just seen. Cherise's plan to extract information failed, and she had to claim that important data had been stolen from the institute and requested the inspector's intervention for justice. Cherise, likely afraid that the inspector would find out unfavorable information from Flynn, decided to confess everything, thereby retaining more control. She explained that the stolen technology from the institute was the highly sensitive neural control device. If this technology was made public, not only would the institute face condemnation, but society would also face a huge threat. The power displayed by Burton and his group was a testament to this. The inspector clearly understood the implications. Cherise seized the moment to request the inspector's intervention to eliminate the Flynn family and Lev across all timelines. It turns out this is why Lev of the theft gang was so fearful of the inspector. Moreover, the inspector had a precedent for erasing entire families, something Cherise was well aware of. Watching Cherise leave, the inspector fell into deep thought. She wasn't sure if she would truly eliminate Flynn and her family for the sake of societal stability. The scene shifts to Officer Tommy, who had gunned down the corrupt sheriff and drug lord Corbell. Afterwards, he realized the madness of his action. But what's done is done. He had to stick to the plan, so he pretended to have just arrived at the scene and called for backup. Soon, a large number of officers arrived. Everyone pointed their suspicions at the hitman Bob. At that moment, a colleague informed him that a victim was still alive. A chill ran down Tommy's spine as he rushed to check the room, only to find that Corbell still had a pulse. Just as he was panicking, news came from the hospital. The murder suspect, Bob, had been killed by the Flynn siblings while on a rampage in the hospital. This would help Tommy cover up his crime, placing the blame for the sheriff's murder entirely on the deceased. Now, the only loose end left was Corbell, who was in critical condition at the hospital. In the future world, a female technician from the theft gang, after gathering Flynn's medical records in the real world, guessed that the lost technical data from the institute might be hidden in her temporal lobe. However, the technician, having her own agenda, didn't immediately report to her boss, Lev. Little did she know, Lev had eavesdropped on her conversation and threatened her with the life of her beloved. Left with no choice, she had to give in and reveal the whereabouts of the technical data. Knowing her boss's ruthlessness, she sought out Cherise from the Institute for Self-Preservation. Using the location of the technical data as leverage, she requested Cherise's help to take down Lev. Cherise agreed that if the timing was right, she would try to intervene. However, the most pressing issue at the moment was to not let the theft gang get hold of the technical data. The safest bet now was to make Flynn disappear from her world. Contrarily, the inspector had a different stance from Cherise and planned to cooperate with Flynn. She could provide resources in the real world for Flynn to fend off Cherise's pursuit and could even help her avoid the end of the world. The avatars of Flynn and her group were unregistered in the future world, hence they could operate with fewer restrictions, making them a formidable weapon against the Institute. As it turns out, the inspector had long been displeased with Cherise's autocratic behavior. Flynn deemed the plan viable, but had one condition: to cure her mother's terminal illness. However, after the inspector connected to the database, the result was that Flynn's mother was incurable and would die in 23 days. Flynn, overwhelmed with grief, logged out and broke down in tears in her brother's arms. Having already lost her father, Flynn was saddened by her mother's impending departure, yet her mother was stronger than she had imagined. Flynn, not willing to give up, logged on again, intending to brainstorm a solution with Wilf. However, Wilf expressed his deep apologies. The medication he had initially used to treat her mother only had a 50% success rate. Understanding his intentions, Flynn chose to forgive him, but Wilf looked disheartened. He felt he should know the hiding place of his sister Alita, but he just couldn't recall. Flynn proposed a method. They could try to establish a mental connection, allowing her to understand Wilf's experiences and thoughts as an observer. Perhaps they could discover clues that he overlooked. Soon, they rubbed their fingers together, and the intentions of both were imprinted in each other's minds. Due to the massive amount of information, Flynn could only selectively pick out some parts. Immediately, she felt Wilf's deep concern for Alita from childhood to adulthood, his utter disgust for his former boss, Lev. In the end, Flynn sneakily inquired about Wilf's feelings for her. Unexpectedly, it was filled with love. Not to be outdone, Wilf also discovered Flynn's feelings for him. The result was the same. They were mutually attracted. Still, neither of them pointed it out because it was not the time for romance. Suddenly, Flynn had a flash of insight about the secret refuge Wilf and Alita had chosen when they were children. Wilf realized the secluded place that only belonged to them was very likely Alita's hiding place. Not long after they arrived at their destination, which had changed drastically, Flynn cautiously withdrew the virtual image to find a figure sitting under the big tree. Upon closer inspection, it was Alita from their childhood. This must be a robot that Alita had made. The robot servant, seeing Wilf approach, said that Alita had been waiting for a long time. However, for safety reasons, only Wilf was allowed to meet her. When the two arrived at an open space deep in the park, the elusive Alita finally appeared. Wilf felt a bit guilty. He should have thought of this place sooner. But Alita said the reason Wilf was like this was that the implanted chip had suppressed part of his memory. After Alita had removed it, she recalled many experiences from her childhood. Then she had the robot dig in place and it dug up a human skull. Alita said this was the place where Wilf's biological parents were buried. It turns out, following the apocalyptic disaster, many survivors contracted infectious diseases. Lev, the leader of the theft gang, feared the spread of these diseases. As such, he had all the refugees in the camp killed, including the parents of Wilf. Later, they used chips implanted from the Research Institute to suppress everyone's memories of these past events, preventing societal chaos. This was the true brutality of the theft gang. Therefore, Alita decided to overthrow it, rallying many of the victims from the past. Wilf felt that the power of these people alone was far from enough. However, Alita had been prepared. The technical data hidden in Flynn's mind was the most powerful weapon. At this point, Flynn was unaware that she had become the focus of various power struggles. She learned from her friend about a piece of crucial intelligence. The Department of Homeland Security had just issued a warning that criminals were planning to blow up a nuclear missile silo not far from the town. Upon hearing this, Flynn acted nonchalant, but her mind was in turmoil. She quickly logged into the future world, intending to discuss the matter with Wilf, but ran into Lev's female technician instead. So she openly expressed her concerns to her. Flynn remembered that in her world it was the explosion of a nuclear missile silo that led to its destruction. Now the same signs were appearing in her real world. She suspected that all of this was the doing of Charisse. After listening, the female technician immediately confessed everything about the information she had given to Charisse earlier. She had not expected Charisse to be so ruthless. To eliminate Flynn, Charisse was willing to use a nuclear bomb to wipe out the entire state. Flynn was thoroughly furious upon hearing this. She realized that to the people of the future world, she and her friends and family were just part of a game. An insane plan formed in Flynn's mind. She immediately found the inspector and asked her to open a new time stake. This way, Flynn could successfully access the technology in her mind from the Research Institute and use it to save the real world from the apocalypse. The inspector had to admit that the plan was incredibly crazy. However, she was unable to open a new time stake, but could provide several branches of the Institute used to manage the time stake portal. But these were already enough for Flynn. Flynn quickly arrived at the address given by the inspector. For the sake of secrecy, the gatekeeper appeared to be just an ordinary suburban man. Flynn, to his surprise, subdued him within a few moves and used his retina to unlock the gate. As she walked in, she was surprised to find a crafted watch in the center of the room. It was the central controller used to manage the time stakes. Suddenly, the system alarm sounded. The wall in front of Flynn disappeared instantly, and several solemn guards appeared. Charisse also learned of this immediately. However, Flynn was not flustered at all. By now, her nerves had perfectly merged with her avatar. A few punches and kicks quickly subdued the guards. Then she swiftly opened the time stake manager and chose a starting point from the extended timeline. She then grabbed the watch and crushed it in her hand. Back at the Institute, Charisse turned pale instantly, for she was unable to determine the exact coordinates of the newly opened timeline due to the destruction of the time controller. Flynn had finally changed from being a hunted prey to a ghostly hunter. But before starting her plan, she had one important step to complete: let the real-world Flynn die. This way, Charisse would not detonate the nuclear bomb in order to kill her, and her friends and family in that timeline could temporarily be spared. Her friend Connor was the best candidate tasked to kill the real-world Flynn. In the real world, Flynn quietly came to the edge of a cliff in a forest. She looked back at the depths of the jungle, knowing that her friend Connor was ready. Then, Flynn began to count down. Once beautiful images flashed in her mind. When she finally counted to 1, the dull sound of a sniper rang out, indicating the sacrifice of real-world Flynn. As it was revealed, the Research Institute was able to track Flynn's real-world location through the timeline, which put Flynn at a disadvantage. This explains why she copied her consciousness and data to another timeline. This time branch could be any moment after Flynn put on her gaming device. Now, because she destroyed the time controller that recorded the coordinates, the Research Institute could not locate the newly opened timeline. In the end of the drama, the scene shifts to the copied Flynn logging back into the future world, where the inspector had been waiting for a long time. Now, Flynn, transformed into a hunter, was determined to begin her wild revenge and self-rescue in Season 2. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.